you worked all week and you're ready to let go. Let me tell you, friend, believe me when I say I know. It always feels like we're punching in. Well, I'm glad you stopped by. The fun is about to begin. You paid good money at the door. Get ready for a real good show. If you want to have a real good time with me tonight, you gotta move like crazy, dancing in the pale moonlight. We can all get down, spin inside out. I'm telling you, if you really want to groove, you gotta make a move.
Right. So our next guest to talk about the upcoming symposium is Ben from Invest Nebraska. We've had on the show before. We've had Dan, did a whole episode on him. We've had Matt, and now it's our opportunity to have Ben Williamson on the show as well. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Ben's perspective on the ecosystem here in Nebraska and how it's evolved over recent years, kind of the landscape for investment here, and his perspective on this symposium and what it means for Nebraska. So go ahead, Ben, and jump right in.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. Excited to chat today. I think the most logical place to start is exactly what you led with, which is the ecosystem, where it's been, how it's grown, and where we're at today. We have an interesting perspective because our ecosystem really only has a history of about 10 years long in terms of really putting resources and infrastructure behind this innovation and technology focus in this ecosystem. And so,
what was the impetus for kind of starting to put resources behind it? Is that pretty much in sync with the timing of the start of Invest Nebraska?
Pretty much. So what it really came down to is you had state and local government who had always been trying to do economic development kind of the traditional way, which is attract big companies to try to bring them
move here. Yep.
And turns out that's really hard to do. It's really hard to quantify the actual economic impact of, and sometimes it just doesn't work very well for states like Nebraska. And so that was one factor. You had another factor, which was we had some really smart, ambitious people looking to start tech companies and be entrepreneurs. And that sort of confluence led the state and many other stakeholders to say, how can we provide that infrastructure? How can we build those resources and things to help give entrepreneurs the tools to get started? That led to what some of your listeners have probably heard before, the Business Innovation Act, which was some legislation passed in 2011 and signed into law in 2011 that allocated a bunch of money to this infrastructure, to these resources. A lot of that grants, some of which we might talk about. A lot of it goes to investment dollars. As you alluded, that sort of not coincidentally coincides with Invest Nebraska and where we came into play in the ecosystem. We started working with the state to administer those investment funds to invest back into high growth technology companies based in the state. The best part, and we'll talk a little bit about having a segmented, focused approach, but the best part was that it was industry agnostic. And so it was focused on medtech, medical device, biotech, but also traditional business-to-business enterprise software, really everything in between. And that was really the impetus to starting that snowball rolling down the hill. Without telling the full story, 10 years later, we are in an exponentially different and better and more mature position. Even 5 years ago, we were still on the sort of shallow part of the growth curve. There was momentum, but we weren't to the point where we had that maturity. We didn't have still a lot of investment dollars or investors at the table. And actually, candidly, one of the biggest things that I think was holding us back, and this is all chicken or egg stuff, but we didn't have enough top of the funnel entrepreneurs. And some of that's cultural, some of that's, it just takes a long time to build these muscles in a state or in an ecosystem. Today, We have a tremendous amount of entrepreneurs, a tremendous amount of deal flow. We have more funders than ever, both in terms of absolute number, but also dollars. A huge number of deals are getting done, much bigger number than even a few years ago. And we're finally to a place where I think you can confidently, leave your job, start a company, graduate, start a company, and you feel like you can do it here in a vacuum with all of the resources, with the investors, the advisors, the mentors, the stakeholders, where before it felt like you kind of had to piecemeal and still go outside the state and have connections elsewhere. I think today that's no longer the case. I'm excited to say.
Excellent. And can you talk a little bit about investment dollars to give people, if it's on the top of your brain, a little bit of scale of where we were 10 years ago versus where we are right now, in both in terms of kind of how you guys are investing, but also the total amount of dollars going into these kind of investments in the state of Nebraska over that time period?
Yeah, perhaps unsurprisingly, it was dismal in 2010. In fact, Nebraska, and maybe this is a stat that's been thrown out before, was tied for dead last in terms of states, in terms of venture dollars and angel dollars being invested in tech companies in the state. Tied for dead last. And effectively year over year, we had roughly $0 going into those companies. Now, of course, some companies were going unreported, but you could make that case for every single state. So we were at the very bottom. Of course, I think we're still the 38th biggest state. So not even doing well with respect to where we ought to probably sit from a purely a numbers and a population standpoint. Over the next 5 years, we started, like I said, growing in kind of a linear fashion. We were getting tens of millions of dollars of investment going into startups. By 2015, we had, I think, eclipsed the 150 million number, and we had actually moved up to the low 20s in terms of that ranking.
Okay.
Today, we are, and that was a little bit of a blip on the radar. There's a company in Lincoln called Huddle that's a sports tech company that raised a big round of capital that year. But we have kind of regressed to where we sit on an annual basis now, which is about 30th in the country in terms of dollars. So we are out kicking our coverage in terms of population size today. And now that number is hundreds of millions of dollars a year in investment going into those businesses. So I think 2021 was around 300 million. Wow. And just to give perspective from the early stage seed fund side of the world where Invest Nebraska plays, when I started at Invest Nebraska 5 years ago, almost to the week, we did, I think, about $2.8 million that calendar year. We invested in, I think, 15 companies. Half of those were new investments, half of those were follow-on investments. This year in 2022, we will definitely do over $6 million, and we might hit 30 investments. And I'm really excited to say about 80% of those are first-time investments. So if you think about that scale just from one small early stage investor, that sort of tells the story as well. And it tells the story that I mentioned before, that we have that deal flow, those entrepreneurs, that many unique, novel, investable startups, to the point where, a couple of years ago, we didn't have that much momentum from that standpoint.
And talk a little bit about this event and kind of your perspective on this event, what it means to the state, what you're going to be talking about, what people can expect.
Yeah, definitely. So I think an interesting perspective to talk about this event in is you go to different ecosystems across the country or the world, and a lot of them try to claim certain areas of innovation and entrepreneurship as something that they are, best in the world or world-class. And that's an interesting thing to do, because if you think about most ecosystems, there isn't actually much of a comparative advantage in some of those places, right? It's hard for someone to claim medtech or fintech or insurtech, because those are things that are pervasive everywhere. You do see some ecosystems that have a critical mass or a certain type of infrastructure that gives them a heads up. And I think that's where medtech comes into play with the state of Nebraska. When you think of Nebraska, if you're from Denver or the Bay or Cambridge, Massachusetts, you might not think medtech right away. But something we've been able to do over the last decade, in combination with some of the amazing institutions in Nebraska and some of that corporate and state and local infrastructure, we've been able to carve out a really interesting medtech ecosystem that I think, to me, includes kind of that biotech side of the world. We have a lot of focus from the state specifically. We have a lot of focus from the universities here. And we have some really great, not only research, but teaching institutions and others that have really gave us this leg up when it maybe isn't obvious to the rest of the world. So of course we have things like agriculture technology that we ought to be really good at. But then we have this other area that's maybe not so obvious within medtech and biotech. That segues nicely into this event. And I think having that experience and that institutional knowledge or brain damage or whatever you want to call it gives us the ability to attract really interesting companies, speakers, stakeholders, and others to put on a really awesome event like this. And so I'm excited to bring all of those together. You know, the best events could all be the same if you're not careful. And really the best events, to me, hinge on kind of two things. One is bringing together a nice balanced mix of those stakeholders, right? So state and local government, university, corporate, startups, entrepreneurs, service providers, investors, bringing all of those people together. I'm really excited because I think they're going to have a great mix and balance of those stakeholders. The second, I think, and maybe this is easier said than done, is the content, and not hearing just the same panels and the same speeches, and looking at the agenda for this event. The speakers are going to be fabulous. I can't speak for my panel because we'll see how that goes. Probably will end up just talking too much, but we have a fantastic panel of entrepreneurs. I'm a little bummed they put the entrepreneur panel first on the agenda because it makes the investor panel seem even more boring. But we really have a nice mix of those entrepreneurs that are building different types of companies, everything from kind of your traditional medical device to some of the more biotech side of the world, and really kind of others that are adjacent to those spaces as well. So those two things stick out to me as things that I think will make the conference really, really exceptional. And I'm excited to continue the momentum we have in biotech and medtech here in the middle of the country. Again, in a place that maybe doesn't stick out as obvious, but when you look a little closer, it makes a heck of a lot of sense.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing your perspective. I'll look forward to seeing you on October 20th, and hopefully some of the folks that are listening to this podcast.